see how that goes. I'll crop it and edit it later. Okay, now, without any further ado, sorry about that, let's have the Prime Minister up to begin the debate. Here.
Okay, how do I do this?
Or do you want to use that desk?
I guess I'll just speak from here, if that's fine.
You can just unplug the charger for now. Yeah, I think if you want that, do that. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's alright. If you want to use the desk, just put the swap the camera up to where that is.
Yeah.
And you speak from there.
So from here?
Yeah. And then
just turn that. Yeah, okay. Oh, this is complicated.
Yeah. Sorry, guys.
Okay. And are we ready? First, let's establish the comparative that all has to defend. I think all has to defend a strong Westminster as the centre of power in the United Kingdom, and why having a strong Westminster somehow or rather undercuts the success of the Scottish independence movement. The pitch from opening government here is simple. Having a taste of independence and having an external locus of power in Holyrood has strengthened the Scottish independence movement. Firstly, characterizing what the UK looked like before 1998 and the formal institutionalization of devolution. I think there was a much more powerful central government seated in London, but moreover, I think this was coming off the back of long years of governance under the Conservative Party, especially just after John Major and Margaret Thatcher, whereby right-wing narratives of unity and conservative traditions, things like loyalty to the monarchy example, was still the norm in the United Kingdom. But moreover, I think in that instance, Scotland didn't have any formal symbol of external power. Holyrood was not a formal institutionalized body until 1998. I think mechanistically, why is that so? I think the impact therefore is that from a retrospective perspective, the rise of pro-independence elements and parties emerged mostly post-devolution, i.e. the SNP only largely started to gain a lot of salience and came into power in the late 2000s, whereas the comparative is likely that Scottish Labour and Scottish Conservatives will still continue to carry out the will of the party overlords in Westminster. Why is that so? Number one, I think these pro-independence elements would have had no official platform to put out their agendas, especially because things like elections for Holyrood, for example, would not have happened, so Westminster's narratives would have obviously taken precedence. Secondly, there are just fewer countervailing narratives that could have only emerged if elements in Scotland had a taste in power. So for example, when you do not have any control over economic policy and economic agenda, is the idea that like Scottish leaders and administrators could not have thought of ways in which they could have modified or strengthened economic policy to serve their interests, because these are things that wouldn't have been in the discussion in the first place, because the discussion surrounding economic policy would have been centralized in Westminster. But thirdly, I think just a huge asymmetry of power between Westminster and Scotland that slowly declined over time. That is to say, if most of the political resources and political decision making was still centered in Westminster, I think they will have the power to be able to quash out anti-independence independence narratives a lot more and shut down the official views and platforms of Scottish nationalist parties on the platform that this is somehow breaking up the union. This is not part of what was agreed upon in any agreements between Scotland and the various countries together with London. The argument from opening government is simple. Number one, devolution has spurred the rise and the concretization of power from pro-independence parties. Why is that so? Three mechanisms. One, it has created a rivaling and independent symbol of power. That is to say, it's allowed pro-independence parties to push forward a platform that is now widely available in the national consciousness in elections. They put out an agenda in their very first place. So you have been able to ingrain Scottish independence in the national consciousness, especially now when you see as an external symbol of power in Holyrood for you to do so. Secondly, it has allowed pro-nationalist parties to build specific economic agendas. That is to say, now since now they are controlling economic policy, and since now they know how much they're getting screwed over by the UK because they are surrendering so much of their North Sea oil reserve profits to the United Kingdom because of the fact that the UK literally is only giving them 41 billion this year. I think these are things that the SNP and other pro-independence parties can now use as the narrative to be able to push for independence. Things like, for example, how the UK steals their North Sea oil reserve profits, how they are unable to establish their own sovereign wealth fund to be able to invest for a rainy day and to be able to build reserves into the future, how they are unable to set low corporate tax rates because corporate tax rates are still set by Westminster as a whole, and therefore they are unable to promote a pro-growth agenda that we are seeing right now happening in places like Ireland, for example, where you're able to facilitate huge amounts of economic growth when the central government radically lowered corporate tax rates. Thirdly, I think it's allowed the impact of Brexit to further exacerbate the pro-independence party's push for independence. That is to say, now they say that Westminster has royally screwed up. We have a potential alternative source of power here in Scotland. We can just ditch the United Kingdom, join the European Common Market, join the Eurozone, and we'll be able to tap on a much larger market and much larger borders and much more open borders to be able to facilitate economic development and growth of human capital. But next, I think it's also allowed pro-independence parties to build positive records in office. That is to say, for most of the late 2000s, the SNP was able to reap the economic benefits of Blair's regime. But additionally, after the Blair regime was defeated, after Gordon Brown was defeated and Cameron rose into power, the SNP was now able to position themselves in counterpoint with David Cameron to say they are the ones that are screwing up our social services, they are the ones that are fucking up the NHS. This is something that ultimately we do not want. We want to restore our social services. We want to restore a high degree of social net and social stability for our country. The impact, therefore, is threefold. A, pro-independence parties have been able to gain huge media visibility and national support. But more importantly, B, they were able to put up forward official platforms of independence that previously were not really ingrained in the national narratives and surround in election campaigns, but are now ingrained permanently in the Scottish election cycles, in the UK election cycles, and in the narrative that most of these parties advocate for. But C, I think it's allowed these parties to build some level of credible track record in office. Not always going to tell you that SNP screwed up recently with the Build House Agreement. I know they're going to run that. Ultimately speaking, popularity wanes and increases over time. Sturgeon lost popularity in the middle of a reign. She managed to gain it back. I think the same can happen for the SNP. CEO.
What policy area tends to win elections?
Economics, national narratives, everything. I don't know. Why has devolution been able to create a rivaling national identity, but more importantly, an ability to collectivize yourselves and position yourselves as an in-group in opposition to other elements? Number one, I think just very straightforward. Now they have control over education policy, and this significantly changes the narrative because this is a long intergenerational impact. That is to say, now you can position yourselves in opposition to the United Kingdom, and moreover, they're going to run some argument that like the UK still has some level of control over the Scottish educational narrative. I think number one, that is untrue, but number two, there's oftentimes now a building narrative that you need to give these devolved nations more freedom and more liberty in the way they have been able to set their education policy. So this is unlikely to happen. I think the intergenerational impact of being able to change the psyche of the Scottish people is very important. Secondly, control over branding and image. That is to say, now they have more ability to do things like brand their trains as Scottish Rail, as Scottish travel and tourism. The fact that you are able to plaster the Scotland label in many other facets of life, not just in like basic things, but also in like economics, and also in policies, and also in government campaigns and narratives. I think this has a huge ability to influence the minds and the psyches of the Scottish people. But thirdly, you are creating an active and separate symbol of independence. So now you have exacerbated the feeling of being an in-group in opposition to other outgroups in society in the United Kingdom. That is to say, when you walk to the ballot box, you are thinking about Scottish independence. When you listen to election campaigns about Scottish independence, you are remembering and listening to those things. For all of those reasons, devolution has significantly strengthened the Scottish independence movement. I'm incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to welcome the officers leaders to begin the case. Let's get here.
Nice one.
This desk is some shit. Sorry, just give me a minute to get notes together.
Cool.
The SNP and other pro-independence actors, which, by the way, I'm sorry guys, did exist before devolution took place. They were kind of why devolution happened. They didn't just emerge in 2007. Talked a very big game before this happened about how much of a difference greater amounts of autonomy would make to the lives of the Scottish people. and it's been fine. It's not been a disaster. I think in many ways it's not been great, but it's certainly not been massively utopian. It probably hasn't been, for reasons I'm going to describe later, a big enough success that you're willing to take the daunting task of leaving the UK. In the counterfactual, you would never have had to have to be faced with the evidence that the utopian stories of just how great Scotland could be if it were given more independence. You would never have to actually be faced with the evidence that those utopian stories were unrealistic. You could just continue living in a fantasy land where the SNP and other pro-independence actors could spin lies about how wonderful everything would be and never actually have to be faced with the fact that ultimately it's probably not that great. That's the case from OO. It's very simple, and I think it's quite clearly winning. Why would the counterfactual have involved massive amounts of radicalization, in particular allowing pro-independent actors to spin these really persuasive, these really persuasive narratives that couldn't be easily contradicted? I think firstly, it's just because having fewer powers and having all policy dictated by the United Kingdom government just feels oppressive on a principled level. I think that's something that's very easy for pro-independence actors to sell to people. I think it's a particularly effective kind of narrative, especially because it's independent of practical outcomes. People just, even if things are going well, people would like them to be going well under their own terms and not having it being dictated to them. At the point at which you've already given people those powers to a large extent, materially over most areas of policy, that argument gets weakened. But I think secondly, and this is the really important part, what devolution, in the absence of devolution, the pro-independence movement would be able to claim that if it had more autonomy, things would be absolutely wonderful. And in terms of why people would believe that kind of narrative, I think there's a couple of things to say here. I think the first thing to say is that people are in general already disposed, Scottish people definitely, to love their country, to believe deeply in its people, and to believe deeply in its potential. I think you therefore have confirmation bias. It's not insurmountable, but I think you have a general disposal towards confirmation bias where you will have more inherent belief in things that fit with your value set in that way. So I think that kind of narrative that would have been pushed by the SNP, that if you had more autonomy, things would have been wonderful, is something that you probably would have thought was reasonably convincing. I think you're also disposed to mistrust statements against this kind of thing, probably interpret them as bad faith actors that are deliberately trying to manipulate you, because that is the way that I think, that is the kind of oppositional way that a lot of Scottish people do view English people. I think this is especially true given that a lot of the best reasons against independence are reasonably complex things, like questions as to whether you'd be allowed into the EU because of the Catalonia issue, currency market stuff, the fact that the North Sea oil wells aren't actually doing as well as OG seems to think they are. At that point then, I think especially then, in the context of a really difficult last 2 decades for the UK, where there have been things like 2008, Brexit, inflation crisis, COVID, and so on, it would have been very, very easy for the pro-independence movement to spin this narrative of how great things could have been. What has happened in the real world? And this is the important part of the case. I would notice firstly, just inherently, given the aforementioned reasons I just described, the pro-independence movement had massive incentive to say things would be really, really great before they got devolution. It was always going to be inherently difficult for the promises to end up, reality to end up matching up to the promises, given how strongly these things were sold. But beyond that, I just want to give a couple of reasons why the reality of devolution has not actually been all that great. Firstly, the now ended dominance of the SNP for a long time meant that it was not held accountable, and as many parties do that are not held accountable, it got shit at governing and became massively unpopular with people. It won a lot consistently for a long time, which meant that mistakes, corruption, voter dissatisfaction, not prioritizing things that voters cared about wasn't something that was actually punished. Bad MPs and members of Scottish Parliament that were not serving their constituency were not punished.
Fraser?
Empirically, we've seen this. Huge amounts of corruption. Sturgeon's own, Nicola Sturgeon, the most popular politician in Scotland, her own husband being investigated for corruption. Hundreds of millions are spent on votes that never actually materialized. Crap infrastructure that has been crumbling for decades. All of that was allowed to build, even as dissatisfaction with the electorate grew, because the SNP were safe in the confidence that until now they were going to end up winning the election anyway. I think the second thing to say, here is that the SNP inherently has difficulty governing effectively and certainly governing coherently. It struggles to do so because it is, other than the one core issue of independence, it is a reasonably big tent party on which there are many people who are pro-independence, whether they're left on other issues or right on other issues, support the SNP. That inherently unstable, divided coalition means that it's very difficult for the SNP to take bold reforms and to look like it's actually changing the status quo. because either the voters or the other members within the party, whatever choice you end up making, you're going to piss off some of them. So its inherent tendency has to be keeping the status quo in place, not actually changing anything, promising things at elections and failing to actually deliver on it. I'll take closing if you have one.
Yes, you're analyzing pretty nicely why they would want the movement. How much of this movement Inan would actually approve them to have?
I'm really sorry, I did not understand that. I'm gonna, Luke can maybe take two. Why does all this matter? Firstly, it is evidence that is before people's eyes in a way that is impossible to ignore that greater independence has not led to greater prospects for Scotland in the way that they were promised it will. Sure, the SNP can always say, but we just need a little bit more devolution and then things would be fine. But notably, the fact that devolution has happened in stages has been inconvenient because at each increased stage of devolution, when they were told this next step was going to be the thing that made the difference, it didn't fucking make a difference. Things ended up staying the same. But I think secondly, it means that the strongest advocates for independence have been tainted by this failure of government. Many Scottish people who are pro-independence don't support the SNP because the SNP is seen as so incompetent and ineffective, so despite their support of independence, they cannot bring themselves to actually vote for them. And that's awful, because it means that firstly, it's harder for the SNP to actually advocate for independence, and it's harder for voters to be willing to go ahead with independence, because given that the SNP would presumably be the government after independence, they don't trust them to not fuck it up. I would notice then that when they talk about various narratives that the Scottish independent movement can use, those narratives are narratives they can use under either side of the House. The comparative in this debate is whether there is counter-evidence to that narrative that is available for people to see. Whether there is counter-evidence to the idea that Scotland will be hugely prosperous when devolution comes. Whether there's counter-evidence to all those things. We get it. You're never going to get it. I think people will believe those lies, and if they do, we have to win this debate. Very, very happy to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now have the Deputy Minister of Education, Mr. Governor, here.
I maybe put it here, is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Should I give you my statement back? Here you go. It is strange to me in a debate about independence movements that the opening government seems to, the opening opposition seems to solely consider a number of pragmatics. I want to note two things, and this will be the primary push of my speech. One, the idea of identity and independence and how those things are interrelated. And the second one is how, when you get a taste of something, you generally want a little bit more. So what do we have in terms of the first idea? And this is directly responsive to the thing that we get. Because they don't contest the idea that devolution resulted in significant formalization of Scottish national parties. They just say, but they did kind of exist before. I want to push back on this claim quite meaningfully in the... wait, it's coming, don't worry. So, how does this actually change the game for Scottish national politics the moment there is an opportunity at significantly greater representation through devolution? Because note, the oversight tells us you get massive and meaningful control over a significant amount of policy. This is materially a change to the amount of people who get to step into leadership and embody policies that govern the spirit of independence. This is, in debating we call it a signaling effect, but it is significantly stronger than that panel. It is an effect of your ability to take a sentiment that has been bubbling under the surface for decades and now concretize that into meaningful, not only policy, but the opportunity and representation. What it means for a young Scottish person to understand that when you can be a Scottish politician who can not only strive for independence, but significantly and meaningfully define what independence means for your country. When it comes to things that are important, like education, like transport, like healthcare, those are the ideals of autonomy that every independence movement has striven for. And it's why specifically, if we look at the context of the United Kingdom, when we understand that, like, for instance, there wasn't a massive opportunity for like a violent rebellion by the Scottish, their only option was to undertake a process through which they would get some level of slow legitimization and formalization. Independence had to happen politically. In the absence of formalized positions, when you know you have to graft to give your parents, to feed your children, or to make sure that your partner is economically safe, I'm not sure how that movement significantly succeeds. However, we've seen in the decades since devolution significant time and investment spent by Scottish individuals to dictate what this nation should look like. This is important because when it actually hits the road, yes, there has been a party that has struggled massively, but that sentiment is resilient. It is something that you now have a significant understanding that can actually manifest. This is exactly why independence movements continue and strengthen, because in the absence, they simply wither, because you have to take care of your family, because you have to earn money, and in the absence of your ability to step in those places, you have a significant inability to do it. You cannot be independent for a living. You can only strive for that, and when you can get paid, when you can be in those positions of power, when you can influence the people who come after you, panel, that is where the independent movement's benefits and ultimately grows. This is an incredibly strong push from our side, because it shows when Rick points out that you literally rebrand your trains ScotsRail. That means something. It gives individuals a meaningful ability to see themselves in those spaces. When we speak about like the signaling effect that comes from representation, it isn't as simple as seeing the colors of a flag on a train. It is what that specifically allows you to visualize yourself. It is the ability to say, I would be willing to dedicate myself to this pursuit of this. Because again, it is significantly easier to dedicate yourself to a legitimate life of political pursuit and policy creation, as opposed to, I don't know, with the alternatives on their side, you know, we just vibe, we try to do independence some other way. Unclear on that specifically. But it means here that devolution was inherently the only opportunity for a modern independence movement to create some level of reasonableness. You know how much legitimacy the Scottish government has? They have a significant amount of control. They're massively respected on the global stage. There is a cultural identity that is bulwarked only through their existence. Look at this dude the chair's wearing a Scottish shirt. Maybe your family's from Scotland, maybe you just like the team. But that is important. That doesn't happen in the absence of this global exploitation of image. It doesn't happen when individuals cannot perceive themselves in those places. This is a massive reason why independence movements require reasonable parts to continue their thing. In absence of that, they simply perish. But I want to go a little bit further. And this is where I'll give you a bit of like an example, right? It's just like, it's really easy to quit drinking if you've never had a drink. But if I give you a drink, you're like, oh, that's kind of nice. Let me see where that goes. This is important because devolution signaled to individuals that not only did Scotland have the capacity, fine, fuck it, maybe, sorry, for the kids, not that, but maybe they don't have as much like profit coming out of the oil reserves near Aberdeen. But it indicates the ability that there is some level of like issue with the way in which the game is being played. That England has way too much of the pie. That there is a significant issue and contestation. What it means, Fraser, is that individuals are now able to visualize and decide what is the meaning of our political spirit. What do we do when we go into access of power? That's why when you see a Scottish politician now, regardless of whether or not their party is weak, regardless of whether or not their party is powerful, they stand and they speak with pride. This is where you see the strengthening of the movement itself. I'm sorry, bro, this is not a debate about pragmatics only. It has to be one about developing a movement, and that's the important thing. Because when you give someone halfway to freedom, you give them the ability to rationalize it. Fraser, and this is where I have to directly respond to the opening opposition, this is their entire case. But they were so bad at it. Oh, we're so sad, because like, you know, we're not doing that well. I'm sorry. This is the most successful independence movement in the world, insofar as it has had an actual referendum. Yes, it failed by a marginal thing. Yes, referendums are difficult to even get on the ballot. Have we seen referendums in any other nation that seeks to gain some level, like the significant level? That is the bar through which you adjudicate this debate. You cannot simply say, but they're not as good as other places. Oh, they haven't fully realized that goal. Am I insane here? But independence is a lofty goal. It is not something that happens overnight, nor is it something that was going to come easily. It is instead something that needs to be undertaken in steps and significant, with some significant level of work. This is important because this is the precursor to that eventual independence. I'll take the back off there.
Why is it that a Scottish voter feels autonomy is more important than a local economy that's directly affecting their job?
Why is it that a Scottish voter likes autonomy? Bro, have you ever like supported a football team and had that football team's like colors on your back? Like the game isn't just economics. I don't like go to lunch and be like, yeah, let me check the Economist, bro. Everyone, what they do is they check out Scottish rugby. They check all of those things. This is important because homies genuinely don't give a shit about the economic policy at the end of the day. No one votes on the basis of that. Most people don't have the time to because we're in a significant inflation crisis. Instead, what they do have the ability to contend with is, does my country have a spirit through which it has the capacity to govern? This is important because we don't make decisions like independence based on these things. But Rick has proven to you, even if that is that case, they've done phenomenally in the pursuit of it. They've given themselves a starting point that I think is not only admirable, but something that should be reproduced across the world. But to be even more responsive here, because maybe they think I'm giving them a bad shout, it's just the fact that even if we have to contend with a poorly functioning SNP, even if we have to contend with those struggles, Why has the spirit continued? Why is there still a continued capacity of this movement to stay in relation to such massive seismic shifts of political goodwill? It only happens in the instance where people can see that another party can fill that hole, because we can govern. We have the understanding and the unique capacity to do it. It is simply the signaling effect. And I know we use that term often, but especially when it comes to independence, it is the ability to see yourself in those spaces that gives us the benefit. And this is why, paired with the analysis that you get in our first speech, we create the strongest case for the strengthening of it, right? It isn't simply a numeric amount. It is a spirit that people feel, and that spirit is something that ultimately results in the level of autonomy that we strive for on behalf of the Scottish people from the opening government. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now we'll definitely just need to conclude the top half. You're here. Move the camera back to have more space.
You can have that back. Whew. That's close.
Thank you. God forbid anyone promising the world is actually forced to deliver. Worst thing for their case. Two things this debate comes down to. One, does the SNP actually have a lower platform as they claim? Do they get to set the narrative less? Two, does governing give or bleed credibility? I think both of these are necessary to win the debate. Start. Does the SNP have a lower platform? Okay, I think it's relies on two things. One, they say that Indy has a low sentiment before. This is crucial to their claim that on the comparative, Indy would never have gained momentum. If we prove that Indy had a strong momentum before, SNP had a strong momentum, then it's likely to have after and can build on the other narrative mechanisms we say. So why is this true? As Fraser points out, they didn't concede devolution for giggles. The very concession devolution primes you to show there were people pushing for this kind of stuff. But why is this true? I want to make it very clear. Historically, Scotland has had a very strong identity. What this looks like is legal independence since the 1700s, health independence. They had a separate Scottish secretary, which ran a lot of stuff from Westminster, but as a separate department to the rest of the UK government. Third, they had their own football team. As you can see in many countries, even as like the body of English identity today, this is an incredibly important focus for identity. What this is to say is that there is an incredibly proud Scottish identity stretching back to like fucking Braveheart or whatever it is, or the narrative is at least, that is mobilised under both sides of the house. This is why the SNP is strong. But two, then point out that Westminster is shit at taking care of Scottish interests, that SNP is excluded from the narrative, that the economic policy has become much better under their side. We agree, this is why Scots are really fucking proud to be Scottish and fucking hate Westminster. This is why Indy is motivational to begin with. What this looks like is they say, oh, Thatcher was happy clappy, there was unity before this. It's news to the fucking Scots. What the Scots had in the 80s was deindustrialisation under Thatcher's policies focusing on London finance. What the Scots had is North Sea oil being used to fund tax cuts for wealthy Brits living in the south. The Scots were not happy going into this. And what this proves is that Scotland is a relatively small part of the UK, its interests are neglected, people get angry over this. This is why historically Scotland has a very important contingent separately that was gaining ground under the SNP. Okay, secondly, why is there realistically a good counter-platform on the comparative? I want to point out two things. One, media environment is supportive of the SNP. Why is this? Most people in Scotland, at the very least, also read local and national media, because the Times very rarely says anything about Scotland. If I want to learn about my country, I read the local media. As a consequence of this is biased towards the SNP, because one, selection bias. If you're choosing to stay in Scotland and Edinburgh versus migrate to London, you're more likely to care about your Scottish identity. You're more likely to support the SNP and Scottish Indie, or at least Scottish identity in that sense. Two, business model. They have to say that there is something unique about Scotland in order to justify them being read versus others. The SNP is the biggest single party for that. They're the ones saying Scotland's unique. They're the ones giving different news that's not there in the south. The South isn't going to focus on the SNPs, it doesn't focus on Westminster, but the North does because they're the people given the new platform. This is why this gets massive amounts of coverage. But 2, social media, that's the comparative really here. Social media, in the present scenario, favours extreme things, because that's the kind of things I click and share and engage with. That means saying stuff like, we're going to be bazillion pounds richer if we leave the UK. That means we can have our own healthcare ministry if we leave. That gets more clicks than heard around boring centrist politician, we can increase tax rates by 1% if we do this kind of stuff. As a consequence of that, the SNP does have a big platform, especially because the youth, their biggest demographic, is a heavy user of social media. So I think the comparative, realistically, is not just the SNP has a platform, also in something like Westminster, where it has a tremendous amount of seats, can claim Scottish identity, as they fail to recognise it does have an institutional bastion, being paid 80k a year to be able to say SNP stuff. But not only that, they get focused on the actual message they want to say, we should have independence, rather than the various issues of what do you think about the local drug policy here. Okay, moving on to whether government credibility gives or bleeds. Quickly taking a point from closing.
Yes. Since childhood, I had a very idealized image of having a unicorn that was never broken. Do you think it stunted my ability to get a unicorn?
Has having a dream of getting a unicorn strangled your ability to get a unicorn? Probably not, because unicorns don't exist, but independence does. I don't think it's relevant. Okay, are people turned off by bad policy? 1, I think this is the key comparative this debate. They say it's all about emotion. I'm actually going to focus on that first. 1, they say you can have national narrative. Again, I already pointed out how Scotland already has a national narrative. The comparative this debate is not whether people are Scottish or not Scottish. It's whether people see Scotland as compatible with Britishness, as they did before the 1970s and the North Sea oil boom, or whether they see it as necessarily an antithetical identity. And note the comparative here. They say there are a lot of die-hard Scots who get a boner when they see Scottish Rail. I suggest most swing voters see a malfunctioning train, and they see it as Scottish Rail instead of British Rail, and they're like, oh, fucking Scotland can't run anything. That's not Britain's fault. At the very least, I suggest most swing voters, who you need to win for the majority of independence, are not motivated by the boner of Scottish Rail, and insofar as they are, they have a Scotland football team, and all that kind of stuff. But secondly, I also want to point out, as Fraser tells you, you get a radicalisation under our side of the house, because they don't get that compatibility of Scottish and British identity. We have pointed out to you why Scotland's care about Scotland. They have done the lovely nice analysis for us of telling you why Scotland gets excluded from Westminster discourse. We tell you to the extent that Scotland's do care about Scotland and are excluded, they are dramatically more likely, at the very least for the median voter, who is the person wafting between these two sides, to say this is incompatible under their side of the house, where they don't get devolution, where they do get devolution, under our side of the house they do get devolution, they get angrier, they're more likely to support Indy, versus being happy with, I can support a reasonable amount of policy autonomy. There's a spectrum of what people support, insofar as there is a spectrum, not everyone is die-hard, not everyone is die-hard Remain. The people in the middle, though, can't get what they want under our side of the house, devolution. As a consequence of that, they're like, oh, well, I might as well go full policy autonomy. But on this final point about are people turned off, no thank you, on how people weigh up serious issues versus how they weigh up identity. I think their case is brilliant for the third of the population that is a die-hard SNP voter. I think the problem is those people are die-hard SNP voters under both sides of the house, okay? The people you are trying to change their minds of here are the people who are median voters, the more disengaged. What are their qualities? 1, they are relatively disengaged and anti-status quo. Why is this? Because they have relatively low information. It's quite easy to see a government functioning off in the far distance, not understand the complex trade-offs they have to make and say, my life is not as good as I want it to be, that government is in power, my trains are not as nice as they want, that government is therefore bad. Insofar as that's true, there is a median voter anti-government bias. But 2, voters vote on vibes. Insofar as Fraser tells you the 2010s have been a pretty shit economic year, and as far as they luckily tell you Scotland is shafted under the comparative economically, people are voting on the vibes of relatively bad Scottish economic problems. Insofar as that's true, if SNP is saddled with that, they say, I'm not voting for the SNP, CF 2024 SNP's collapse. Under the comparative, they are saddled with someone else, and that's important, because the SNP is a very broad coalition, as Fraser tells you. What that looks like is you have right-wing Cabe Forbes evangelical fiscal austerity, and you have left-wing Hamza Yousaf, who formerly wanted to ally with the Greens. It's hard to hold that coalition together when you actually have to make decisions. It's very easy to do so, as Fraser points out to you, at the point at which I'm able to promise the world and not have to actually be accountable for it. They say, oh, I blame David Cameron. The whole point of our analysis on stuff like disengagement is most voters aren't listening to you when you say I can blame David Cameron. They see your train of shit and they say I'm not going to vote for you anymore. It's being saddled with that, being forced to focus on drug policy when your indie party is the worst world. We are happy to vote.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now have the government member up to begin the closing half of the debate. Do you hear?
Place for so much pages. Lovely.
You want another pen?
That's fine.
Like your file. Not yours. This one.
1 second. Okay. Cool. I will be starting in 3, 2, 1. We completely agree with OO. What do I mean by that? We agree with OO that probably the Scottish independence sentiment would be pretty strong on both sides because all of the reasons we already heard in this debate, right? Because there's a very big cultural difference, because it's very easy to rile up people, and all of those things. What OG do not deal with is the fact whether the devolution actually makes it more possible or not. What do I mean? When we're saying that something strengthens the independence movement, obviously if it becomes more popular but doesn't have any actual power to give any results, doesn't have any actual chance to achieve independence and give Scotland another referendum, it is meaningless if everyone really rallies for it. This is what we will show you, why it gives the Scottish independence movement a bigger capacity to actually get a referendum for independence, and without the devolution, even if every single Scotsman was really pro it, the Westminster government just wouldn't give another referendum ever. Why do we think the capacity to gain independence is very important and more important than how popular it is? First of all, we do think that it's a lot harder to achieve and a lot less trivial, right? But secondly, we're talking about the fact that without this burden, I already said this. Moving on. So, please notice, independence depends on Westminster to actually go along with it, right? Which is not a very easy task. Why does it only happen on our side? AKA, why without devolution you would never have a PM like Starmer actually giving another referendum, and in our side it is possible? First of all, we're talking about amount of political power. What do I mean by that? First of all, you need now the SNPs, or whoever is the ruling party in Scotland, you need their cooperation. If we didn't have the devolution and Starmer wants to, I don't know, do something in Scotland that he needs to happen in order for his plans to be better fulfilled, he wants more taxation from the Scottish people, he wants to build more roads that will help all of the UK, without the devolution he can do it without ever consulting with the SNP or without ever giving them something back in return. On the comparative, in our side, where there is devolution and when there is a Scottish government, you actually have to have some sort of negotiations with them, right? In order for you to get the things you want done in Scotland, you have to actually see them and actually give them some concessions to things that they want, so they are a bigger party politically, when without it they will be just a niche party that is always under opposition and no one actually has to consider. Second reason, there's an ability to make specific plans that wouldn't happen unless we had devolution. What do I mean by that? Especially after Brexit, people and politicians in the UK are very afraid of making big decisions without a specific plan of how to implement them. The problem with Brexit was that there was a referendum on getting independence from the EU, but it was a horrible catastrophe because there was no specific plan anyone voted for. No one knew how is it going to be, and there was a whole logistical mindfuck. That's why if there is not a specific plan for Scottish independence, it would never be a politically viable option. Only on our side, when you have a specific government that is currently governing Scotland, when it can offer you a specific plan of how this transfer of power is going to look, of who is going to be the new Minister of Education, only then it is something that UK politicians and people can actually accept. On the comparative, it feels like another Brexit all over again. It feels like giving independence without actually having a stable power to actually take over and without having a solid plan. Before I move on, closing first.
Okay, yeah. Your example of Brexit passed precisely because Brexiteers didn't have to commit to a specific plan. They weren't in government. They could say, you can have whatever you want, just vote for us and we'll sort it out later. The comparative proves that the SNP would be stronger on your side and use their majority in Parliament to say they're legitimate to do it. The same mechanisms are comparative.
Okay. again, what I am saying is that in the end of the day, we all agree that probably, Scottish independence, like complete independence, wouldn't happen until this day in both sides, right? Because it wasn't popular enough, because when there was a referendum, people said no. What is relevant is whether it will happen in the future, whether looking forward, the prospect of getting independent is stronger because devolution happened or is not. Because Brexit happens on both sides and because there is this trauma, it will not happen again with Scottish independence. Third mechanism, you have a specific partner to bargain with. What do I mean? When you have a really, really strong party and government from Scotland that is actively badgering you, that can offer you political deals and favors, it's a lot easier to buy into that as a politician than it is when it's a general social activist movement. But fourthly, it is a lot more easier for my voters as a UK Prime Minister or as a UK politician to actually be okay with me giving independence to Scottish people because of the devolution. What do I mean by that? Without the devolution, the act of giving a referendum, the act of giving Scottish independence is seen as something very, very extreme, right? Because Scottish up until now was a part of the UK. It's ripping apart the UK. It's doing something that is basically political suicide, especially with all of the narratives about union in the UK like we already heard. With devolution, it's something that UK people are a lot more ready to accept, right? They're already used to the fact that Scottish people have independence to an extent. They already feel that they're a different entity from them and will not be as angry at the Labour Party or at the Tories for letting them go. What did you get until now? The bottom line here is very, very, very simple. For Scottish independence to be true, it doesn't help that only people want it, right? Because people have a lot of reasons to want it on both sides of the debate. On both sides of the debate, you have a UK government that did really badly in the last 15 years. In both sides of the debate, you have a history of colonization that people want to break free from. The relevant question is whether the movement is strong enough to actually do what it wants to do. Well, it is strong enough to make that independence happen in the future, and only on our side will it eventually happen, because only on our side is it politically viable for a UK minister to give it, only on our side do they have the bargaining power, and only on our side does it seem like a realistic enough plan for enough people to opt into it, vote for it, and for enough politicians to actually make it happen. For all of those reasons, please.
Please write to your partners. I'm sorry for badgering. Please do not whisper to each other. Thank you.
Sorry if we
No, it's not personal to anyone. I should have said it in the start.
Okay, panel ready? Cool. OG claim that people are united by love. They see Scotland doing nice things for them and vote for independence as a result. I think the problem inherent here is that when you are setting out visions for a new kind of world, when you're creating a new reality, you have competing ideas of what that should look like, right? As I would claim, right, you're not trusting the competence of the government on here, right? I think that means that you see a lot of infighting over what this looks like, especially if you've seen policy fuck-ups in your own country before with the devolution powers, right? I think on the comparative, we say nothing unites people like hate, right? I think the sense of injustice, having a villain to crowd around that like people fucking hate, means that people unite a lot more strongly. And no, anger is a really strong motivator because it's such a strong feeling that people want to rally behind. People love like gathering together in protests to rally against like an oppressive force. It's why people turn up to protests, like teachers like I did, protesting against the Tory government because they were fucking us over, right? I think it just elicits such a strong emotional response that people like want to act on it and like lobby against it, right? I think our case is pretty clear. We're just going to give our comparative, then we're going to give their comparative and explain why things are better, right? I just think that without devolution, England is just better placed as a villain to rally people behind. But note as well, when you're not discussing like policy fuck-ups in the country and how that could impact the future. It just means that you're a lot more united because you just unite behind hate rather than love for your country, which is a bit wishy-washy, right? I really, really hate that I'm doing this, and I'm so sorry to everyone in the room, but I think Brexit is just a clear comparison. That doesn't mean I'm comparing Brexit to Scottish independence by any means. But look, we had this in the UK. The UKIP party formed around hatred of the EU, right? I fucking hate UKIP, I hate Brexit. But like, look, it just happened, right? UKIP were never going to secure the votes that they needed, but what they did was much more harmful, because what they did was that they forced concessions from major parties for referendums on like EU like membership, right? So firstly, I think when enough people are falling behind this party, and I think note in Scotland, it looks like people who would traditionally vote Labour now voting SNP as a protest vote, you probably get less voters, but it means you're now forcing Labour to make certain concessions to push for referendum and to like go into these discussions for independence as well. But secondly, I think when you solely form around this idea of a pressure group, when you solely form around the idea of independence, like UKIP did, it means you now look non-political, like it sounds silly, but you look non-political outside of the political issue that you're formed around. So UKIP, like Brexit for instance, that was not a left-right issue, that was just a solely we want to leave the EU issue. It wasn't left or right wing, it was seen in its own vacuum of Brexit vacuum that people voted on. That's why you don't really see like a huge amount of right-wing people voting Brexit. It's quite evenly split between left and right because it exists beyond the political spectrum within the country, right? I think that means that you get stronger buy-in for it because it's not seen as political in the way that the SNP are now, and like oftentimes is where the policy fuck-ups come from. But secondly, what I think happens now is that the media in Scotland just blames London for like everything, right? Because they literally can't not blame London because it's London that, like Westminster, that is making these decisions that like drip down into Scotland essentially, right? And whenever there are problems, they see the concentration of power in London and literally go to that as a default. But note as well, when you have like a strong pressure group, like the SNP, maybe in this case, or maybe it's named something else, they are pushing in the media for London to be blamed for this. They're like centering discussions around how shit London is and how you want to dissociate from it. But note as well, there's also an incentive because there's an incentive for more clicks and engagement to be around the hatred of London because no, anger is a strongly acting like motivator, meaning that it means that probably people share it more on social media. People will click more on videos and be more active on social media and things that make them angry because they want to express their views either for or against it, which means that's the kind of algorithms that have precedence, that are like preferred or whatever, right? Look, I think it just allows Scotland to issue responsibility because you can't blame Scotland and the media is centred more around London as the villain here.
POI.
Thirdly, I think people vote for the Independence Party because they crowd around this London hate. Because now there's no political decisions in the party or policy fuck-ups like recently, which allowed Labour to win in Scotland, that can cause people to vote for different parties because they are voting purely on independence rather than policy. So it means that when people turn up to protest more, it means that they vote for those parties in elections. It means that they probably lobby their MPs more on this issue, and they probably do this more when it's not perceived as political. Before I go into the counterfactual on your side, OJ.
As per O's analysis, hatred for Westminster and the emergence of independence movements would have existed with or without devolution, but with devolution you give institutional capacity and narrative setting power to pro-independent Scottish elements to push for independence.
Thank you, I'm about to go on to that. Right, it's a really nice fucking carrot, right? Because on government side, devolution looks like the UK government being really nice. It looks like them giving you more agency that you want to buy into. It looks like they're not having control over your lives anymore, that they're giving you the capacity to run your own hospitals, to run your own schools, to run your own transport systems, the things that tangibly affect people in their day-to-day lives. Like, you can't just go on a train anymore and be like, oh, fuck this train, it's really late, I hate Westminster, because that's fucking stupid, it's Scotland that's running it now, right? It just looks like too much of a carrot. Like, I think that the way that people interact with it is that, like, because these are the most tangible issues that people interact with, that they see on their day-to-day basis, it now means that, like, the SNP or the parties running in Scotland are the ones that are held accountable for any kind of issues within these, right? It means that you have less ammunition to weaponise an independence discussion with this. But note as well, in my POI to OG, I just got, like, I basically try to preempt for them that a lot of people vote in elections based on the economy, right? Because look, I think there are huge numbers of people who vote on like economic stability, because proximate issues like jobs, factories, food prices are all contingent on like the economy being stable and like people being looked after, right? I think until Brexit, UK economy was doing pretty great. We were one of the leaders in Europe, which means that Scotland often felt like it was relying on UK trade relations and deals, even for Scottish industry, like oil, for instance. There was a lot of question marks around how would that translate into going into the future, whether Scotland would lose out on all of these trade agreements, which means that now it looked more risky to vote to leave the union because we couldn't rely on that going into the future. Look, I think the crux of our case is firstly, Westminster just doesn't impact schools, hospitals or transport that people interact with every day, meaning there's limited leverage to weaponize against the UK there. But secondly, right, I think there is a large degree of economic insecurity which can drive swing voters to be more cautious and to vote Remain. Sorry, do you mind if I just catch my breath outside for a second?
Sorry, we'll just give her a second to come back. You can jump and get ready if you need to.
Sure.
We will not complain over more time to analyze country words.
No, you're all good.
Sorry.
No, you're all good. Thank you very much for that speech. And we'll now call the government group to jump in. Here.
I will start in 3, 2, 1. The reason Catalonia is still part of Spain, despite them really not wanting to be a part of them. The reason Scotland is still part of UK, despite them really not wanting to be a part of them, is not because they do not want independence. It's not because it's not a popular movement. It's not because people do not like it. I think what's lacking them to be a strong movement, a capable movement, is their ability to affect the power that keeping them hostage. There are two main clashes in this debate. The first clash is popularity inside of Scotland, in which we agree that First House did a great work. Please shut up. The second clash is power against England. And here I think that Rina gives you much better analysis of their ability to affect England. A, in the way to making more policies that allows Scottish independence, as OG wants but never proves, but on the second level, in the final steps to actually have Scottish independence. Before I dive into it, I just want to flag. We do not do rebuttals to opposition and to CO that did not extend it over OO because we agree with them. They didn't do rebuttal with us because they do not want to engage with us. We are not the same, and if they're actually going to rebuttal our case, I would like a POI and an option to engage with it. I would like to say one thing about the Brexit analogy. The difference about between Brexit and breaking up from Scotland, and it is critical, is that in Brexit only the UK needed to decide that it does not want to be a part of the EU. EU didn't need to give its consent to it. Here you have to have UK's consent to every fucking thing that you do, which means that the moment you do not show how you can affect the UK, you do not have a strong movement. You have a very popular movement who is bashing its head against the wall and can do nothing for Scottish independence. Let's come a little bit into our way. On the first level, when England is the part that it's dependent on, please notice that we have a much bigger impact. What I mean, even if you buy that the strength of analysis on both benches is similar, I think that there is a consensus in the room that the SNP will come to power. I do not think that this is the crucial burden. I think that agrees that it came to power because of the development. The question is did it fuck up or did it do good? I think that the more relevant question is not whether it's popular in Scotland, is how the fact that the SNP was in power affected England. Because it's much harder to convince the English people to bargain with Scotland than to convince the Scottish people that they deserve the right to self-identity, that they deserve the right to independence, and then they deserve a separate separate country? No, not now. On the second level, we think that it's beneficial for Scotland either way, because even if the SNP is fucked up, you can still blame it on Westminster and idealize the idea of a free Scotland. On the comparative, we think that the UK needs a clear image of how a free Scotland looks like. This on the third level, we think that the UK is simply the bigger blockade here. How does Rina win this clash? We do agree from OG that we get the assumption that because the SNP was powerful, you got a referendum. But please look at your pages. All of their analysis is about how they got stronger in Scotland. All of their analysis is about how the fact that they built rails made them more popular with the Scottish people. How it made the idea of breaking free more visible. How does Rina extend over it and why this is critical? On the first level, she shows you why only now the English are dependent on them. What does it mean? It means that each time that the English want to raise taxes, do something in the Scottish education system, they have to give something to the SNP in return. They have to. You never said this. They have to do something for the ideology. What does it mean? It means giving Scotland more individual ability. It means giving them a time for a referendum. It means making the derivative bigger. On the second level, Rina showed you that none of the people in this room actually analyzed why would they get investment before Brexit, and she analyzed why after Brexit, if you not have a concrete plan of how you're going to rule Scotland, of how clear it's going to be, no English person would ever allow a referendum, and this is the only way that politicians can stay popular and offer Scottish people a referendum. Before I continue, Rina took first. Second, do you have a POI? Okay, first.
Okay, yeah, your case is about the institutional base and distinction of Scottish nationalism. Given that we still have the majority of Scottish MPs in Parliament on our side, with funding, representing the will of the people, with a vision that they can give on that platform, it's really unclear why that's comparative.
Because now England have no reason to help them. Yes, you have Scottish people, but they have to keeping up to the current status quo for to stay popular with the English people, because the English people are afraid of another Brexit, and of another economical catastrophe. The third thing that Rina brings you, and it also is crucial, is now you feel like you're giving up less. When you have less control over Scotland, when you initially decide about less things about them, it's much easier to convince the average English voter to give them independence, because you do not feel that you're doing such a big sacrifice. What are the impacts of this? On the first level, we think that we get much more gradual steps in the long term to gaining more Scottish independence and then gaining more rights. But we also think that only on our level, only when you actually have a leverage against England, only when England has something to lose if she do not work with you, you can gain Scottish independence in France. Please us.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now to wrap up the debate, we'll welcome Dr. Schmidt here.
I think there's been a comparativeness issue in this debate, and I think that's the primary reason why Laura wins this debate. It's because Laura explains to you and describes more clearly than opening opposition how on the counterfactual you now have a version of the SNP that is sort of different to their version but still exists on our side notably, that is able to crowd around a singular device of hate for London and use this to gather a number of voters. I don't think that O actually claimed this. O simply claimed that devolution was bad, and that is the larger framing of their case. Okay, to some more specifics. I'm going to start by going through OG, then I'll do CG, and then I'll finally weigh off with OO. Okay, firstly, what do we get from OG? Okay, the main thing about OG is on a taste of power, e.g. symbols, e.g. SNP blames London, or you use healthcare education as ways of getting things, right? I just think these are largely uncomparative, right? Like, firstly, the SNP has incentives to do the same thing on our side of the house, right? Like, the SNP presumably is targeting a voter base that also wants independence in London in a world where devolution doesn't exist, and therefore they also blame London for all of these things, right? So I don't think ideas like the SNP blaming London or using healthcare and education as a way of gaining votes is very comparative here, insofar as they already have incentives on our side of the house. Then the strongest thing they have is this idea of symbols and Scottish traits. I think O will respond to this by talking about Scottish identity, but I have a more strong response, which is purely tourism. That is to say, both Westminster and Scotland have incentives to have unique Scottish branding, even if Scotland is a member of the UK and isn't devolved, which enables things like Scottish trains to exist, which enables things like a Scottish flag and other monuments, because it attracts tourists, it brings a lot of money into the country, and it presents our culture in a unique way. Like, more intuition for this is, I come from a city in Hull in England. We have a company called Hull Trains. It's not unique to being devolved that enables you to get these things. Rather, both parties have this incentive, and as a result of tourism and money incentive, you want to do these things actively anyway on both sides of the house. Note, this is more convincing than what OO tell you in response, because they simply rely on the idea that you have an identity. What we tell you is, this identity goes further, and you want to realize it and actualize it into things like flags and trains and other kinds of things, because it adds tourism, and this incentive exists on both sides of the house. So I think that still exists and is largely uncomparative. At the end of that then, I think what Laura tells you about how people can crowd around hate for London, which they previously couldn't do, because note, a lot of blame could have been placed on the or is placed on the SNP on their side of the house, at the point in which SNP has more control over certain things, and so when things inevitably go wrong, as they do in any state, you're more liable to blame the SNP, and London, which has more money than Scotland does, is able to publish media that blames the SNP rather than London. The counterfactual that Laura presents to you is very clear on this. That is to say, what you have now is you have Scottish media and other forms of media that physically can't blame Scotland, and they want to gain clicks. Given that they want to gain clicks, they find it very easy to blame London, given, you know, like colonialist narratives about how they've taken control of other countries before. Just the general injustice of it all means people will click on it. People like to hate on people, and when you have this article about how London is actively destroying Scotland and the media has active incentives to do this, they're going to want to publish these kinds of things far more on our side of the house, and this means people are reading this kind of content and gathering around this kind of injustice and using it as a key voting point. Next, on to CG. Okay, CG talk a lot about acceptance. Okay, actually, before I do CG, I'll do OO first, not yet. Okay, what do OO tell us? OO tell us a few things, right? The first thing they tell us is that devolution went badly. Look, this might be true. The problem is, I don't think most people perceive this to be the case. There's a few easy reasons for this, right? Both sides have incentives to make it seem as though it's successful. Westminster wants to look good. They want the local Scottish population to seem as though Westminster was giving them actively good concessions that helped them. This means you have a lot of media that makes it look good. The SNP in Scotland also wants it to look good because it wants to be viewed as a competent leadership there, right? That means people don't know about how crude oil, etc. is failing. Rather, they just see Scotland as this, you know, Highlands place with lots of tourism, etc. No one actually focuses on these other ideas, and therefore people just in general are less aware of this comparatively, right? right? That means even local Scottish population are often told by their populations that actually devolution was a good thing, and you're often able to blame other external issues on places like London, etc. Therefore, I think even if they're right about devolution going bad, I don't think it's the most comparative thing in this debate, insofar as it's not told to people, and so they don't have epistemic access to this in the first place. Even if you view your trains going slow, you can blame this on other things that weren't devolution, right? And you could say devolution was still a good thing, but there are improvements to be made, whatever. What Laura tells you is far more convincing, right? Because Laura explains to you ammunition and capacity to hate on London and how much more it increases, right? This means that you can, where on counterfactual you would blame the SNP more, as I've already told you. Not yet, not yet. Okay. The other thing they tell you is about media incentives and how they'll be like pro-SNP media. Look, that's just uncomparative as well. On either side of the house, they'll probably be pro-SNP media. Rather, what's different is how much they hate London on the comparative, which is uniquely what Laura tells you. And so even their journalism arguments aren't the most comparative. Laura still wins on this. Oh, another thing that pissed me off, they said unicorns don't exist. But the national animal of Scotland is unicorns. Like, they can't be saying that around here. It's not, it doesn't run, not yet. Okay, finally, where was it? Okay, no thank you. So I think the strongest thing that they actually have is that often people don't vote for the SNP because they have such a spectrum of left to right. The problem is they don't explain the counterfactual of what the SNP looks like on the delta. Only Laura characterizes this. What Laura explains to you is you can use you view the issues in your local economy, and rather than having to publish manifestos about what you would do to fix the economy, rather you can concentrate your manifesto even further on just hating London and blaming them and gathering people under this injustice and gathering people under the fact that you want a referendum regardless of anything else. It can be a key and vocal central point that even includes issues about the economy, because you don't need to have separate policies about this now. You can singularly have policies around this thing. At that point, Laura has more clearly convinced you how on the counterfactual this actually exists. I'll take a few out from opening.
On your side, and all corroborates this, the SNP is a big banner of disparate individuals with no consistent record on economic and social policy, so there's no rally effect.
No. Listen, on the counterfactual, it's very clear, right? Because there is an active voter incentive for this kind of referendum. Like on both sides, we're conceding there is some incentive for independence to exist, and that incentive translates into some amount of political party. Like, we know from characterization on top of that the SNP already existed. At that point, what that means is, like, if the infrastructure already existed, then there was already something in place for these kinds of things to happen. Okay, finally, weighing against CG, and then I'll just finish everything up. CG talk about acceptance and like, okay. CG's main mechanism is that you now have a political body to talk to. I think this is also uncomparative insofar as the SNP probably still exists and you can talk to these people, right? I think the sort of best thing probably coming up from CG is the idea that the average English person probably cares about this. The reason we weigh over this is because the average English or Welsh voter is removed from the issue and often doesn't care. They're voting on their local constituency issues or things that proximately affect them rather than Scottish independence. So often they're unswayed by things like this because it just doesn't affect them that much. What does change massively is how the Scottish population internalizes this, and how their local media and politics changes in a way that's more convincing to them and means that they're more able to vote for the SNP, which is more likely to lead to a referendum than the counterfactual. Thanks.
Hey Russ, that's speaking of the next first floor check again, set out file her result for about 3 minutes.
I'm going to risk my Yes.
Sorry, I'm just going to quickly check.
Thank you everyone very much for that debate. I personally really enjoyed it. As you can see by the Scottish jersey, my grandma is Scottish to answer the question from earlier in the debate, so they're my second rugby team behind the Wallabies. But like, I really enjoyed the debate. The discussion was really well done and very interesting as well. What we'll do for this oral adjudication is a couple of pieces of general feedback, the result, and then the reasons for the result. So the first thing I want to say in general feedback is just I think there needs to be more POIs in the debate. I think there needs to be a lot more engagement offered from all teams throughout the debate to be asking more POIs and trying to jump into the debate a bit more. I think the second thing, and this is something we discussed as judges a bit during the prep time, was the word strengthen this debate actually could mean a hell of a lot of different things. So I think maybe an interesting route this debate could have taken was a bit more of like, what do we actually think strengthen means? What is the most important or most relevant definition of strengthen here? Is it like movement numbers? Is it the idea of independence? Is it a sense of nationalism? Is it practical outcomes of like successive referendums, whatever? I think that could actually have been up for debate, not definitional debate, but up for a debate about what we think to strengthen means in the movement. That's not to say this debate isn't bad, it isn't good because it didn't have that, but I think it could be an element teams could explore. And the third thing we just want to say in general feedback, I think there is good rebuttal at times in today's debate, but I think teams could have done a bit more to engage with each other's cases, a bit more directly, a bit more charitably. I think at times it was a lot of just other team makes a claim, our response is the claim we made earlier, without actually engaging a bit more rebuttal in the debate. All right, in terms of the result then, we ultimately came to a consensus decision. The first went to opening opposition, narrow second to opening government. We then thought it was a bit of a clearer margin into the closing half teams, with the closing government taking the third and the closing opposition taking the fourth. Again, the closing half was narrow as well between the two teams. So let's go through those ranks. I think given the way the results have fallen, the easiest thing is probably just to go chronologically through the debate. So let's start with the top half and why opening opposition takes out opening government. So I think there are probably two broad parts of this debate. I guess the first one is this idea of a sense of feeling of nationalism, a feeling of independence about Scottish people, and how they can, a sort of sense of cultural identity. I think this becomes really clear, particularly in the DPM speech, about why visions of identity, seeing yourself as having the capacity to be independent and form your own sense of self, is really important for independence movements, and the fact that devolution has given Scotland a degree of power to achieve that sort of social sense of being independent and social sense of power and control of themselves. I think the problem here with this claim for opening government is that opening opposition points to a number of ways in which this sense of nationalism or sense of capacity can already be achieved in other metrics. We hear things about being like a separate legal entity since the 1700s, having their own football team and having their own sort of parochial sense of nationalism, but also the fact that nationalistic parties existed pre-devolution. And so what that I think suggests, and is proven by opening opposition, is that a lot of the factors we're talking about from opening government did already exist and could likely continue to exist. I think there's some scope to say that maybe they get a bit stronger potentially as a result of this, and maybe devolution helps them a little bit or can add to that. But when we compare it to the second issue, I'll go into a second, about like the dream versus the reality, I think that starts to outweigh that second issue, that first issue a little bit more. So let's talk about that second issue about the dream versus the reality. So I think what we get from opening government is this idea that, well, the taste of power is what shows that it's possible, it's plausible, and then people want to have more. So we've got some control over healthcare, etc., and that's what's going to inspire people to say, well, we've done this, we can do more and keep pushing for more and more and more. I think what opening opposition is able to do cleverly here is point out that the way in which that devolution has actually ended up functioning for the SNP, which has functionally had the power for the majority of that time, has shown that Scotland has actually been very bad at it. So this is like looking at the way in which like infrastructure, healthcare, etc. has gone down, but also that the party that's had power and would conceivably have power in the counterfactual has abused that power, has gotten corrupt, has gotten lazy over the time in government, and it's actually resulted in a worse outcome. I do think it is, as an aside, contestable whether the SNP would be in power that long absent devolution of power, but that's not a question made in the debate. So willing to believe that from the opposition, this is what would likely happen, and it leads to all those problems. So at that point, then I think that the reality of governing is actually a lot more difficult, and has shown that not necessarily going to be able to do a good job at it. I think the second thing they add then is the differentiation of blame. So the question of like Scottish Rail versus British Rail, and the idea that, well, it's much easier to blame London and somebody else when you don't have control and power over that, which allows you to present a far rosier, prettier picture of what it's going to look like compared to the reality of what it's ended up looking like. And the problem with being Scotland is you only blame the Scottish government. You start to lose a bit of faith in that independence and the capacity you actually have to do that. So I think at that point then, it probably takes a bit of the wind out of the sail of how likely or how good independence is going to be, because it doesn't show that Scotland can successfully have that much more power. The one last thing I'll note here, and this was a bit hard to fit in, but the response we get from Op-Whip of like, well, Hull Rail still exists and Hull is not a semi-devolved state of the UK and things like that. It probably can't factor into the opening half discussion because it comes so late, but I think it was an interesting response about maybe how these things can still coexist or not coexist. I think it's a bit more of that sort of approach would have helped sort of maybe sell that issue a little bit more. But at the end of the top half, we're convinced that like ultimately the reality of having these devolved powers has done more to damage the vision of a capacity of Scotland to be independent, and that most of the social, cultural stuff can already exist otherwise without having the devolved powers. Let's start bringing in the closing half teams then, and why they aren't able to get up. I think I'll note for both teams to start with, is that we both, or the whole panel thought that both teams relied too much on their openings and were too derivative in today's debate. While both teams did add new things, like a new example, a new mech, a new way of framing it, all of that seemed to be based around the same ideas, the same pushes of their of their opening without adding a significantly better version of that would warrant coming up above that. Ultimately, to TLDR it, we think that closing government does a little bit more new stuff compared to closing opposition, which is why that split happens. But let's get into a little bit more detail on that. Let's start with the closing government team. So in terms of closing government, I think the new thing we liked from closing government was this idea and focus on this is a pathway to independence. This is how we can start to, the strengthening we're talking about here, by having devolved powers, it helps us push more to a focus on independence, and that being through like negotiating, the power you have now, the capacity to influence Westminster, etc. We think the better parts of that were the idea about influencing Westminster politicians to allow the referendum in the first place, to carry weight for it. The less good parts are about convincing English voters and individuals on the street who didn't think how much power or relevance they have. I guess we can make the link about them wanting to push their MPs, make an issue, etc. But those things I think weren't made by closing government, so it was too much of a voter draw. But the better stuff was around how the capacity to influence politicians, etc. The problem with that, I guess, is a lot of that is quite similar as well to the influence material that opening government brings us from Prime Minister about the capacity to influence people, capacity to influence how politicians work as well. But also the remainder of the case from closing government is about the existence of devolved powers and shows capacity to do it. We do think what that does, though, is provide a path, sort of how we get a more stronger movement here. The problem is, though, that like maybe you get the referendum, maybe you get a stronger movement, but ultimately comparing that to what O has given us about why that is likely to not be successful because of all the problems that have happened, means it's not enough to break into the top half of the debate, but it is enough to break up over closing opposition. So if we look at, and the last thing, so there's also a couple other responses on the short cross that also blocks CG from getting in the top half of the debate. That I think is firstly the POI that's given to Gov Whip about the idea that the nationalist Scottish parties are still in Westminster, so a lot of the influence and power to negotiate and bargain, etc., already occurs in Westminster. Having devolved powers is not clear how much additive additional power that gives versus the negotiating power that is already present in that parliament. And I think secondly, I think there was needed a lot more direct rebuttal and engagement with closing government to the best visions of OO's case that come out. I think absent that, it was hard to credit that as being more important than the opposition gives us. So that's why CG ends up parked in the third today. Comparing it to CO then, I think CO gives us some good, interesting framing around villain to hate in England, and obviously as an Australian and as someone who likes to see England lose the Ashes every year, I really bought into that. But more seriously on the debate, I think the framing of unifying around a common enemy was very good. However, while like a good way, I guess, of framing it and differentiating it, it ultimately ended up boiling down to the same thing of like, we can blame someone else for our problems when it's not attached to our name and it's not attached to being our responsibility, which is the case we already have heard from opening opposition. So I don't think it adds a significantly a huge amount more there to the case. And I think then the second half we get an extension about things, and similar to that, I think the Brexit analogy is a useful analogy to help prove that, but I think it's adding another example that helps just prove something we've already believed without being the reason why we believe it, or the best reason why we believe that case as well. The next thing we get about why about the comparative and how it looks under the SNP, etc. I think also that is quite derivative and borrowed from opening opposition as well. So there's not a whole lot of significantly new material here we can credit. Whereas we compare that to CG, we at least have the stuff around the pathway to an independence referendum as being a newer contribution. And I think the last thing I note on CO is just all the stuff we credited opening of government with earlier. I don't think there's enough given to deal with the material and why the taste is useful, or why the national identity is useful in a way that was different or more important than what opening opposition gave. The last thing I'll note is that we thought some of the stuff that was done by closing government was just a knife of opening opposition in terms of like why the devolution would be reported differently, why people wouldn't feel that harm, etc. We thought that just wasn't nice, so it just wasn't considered or counted in the discussion of the debate, and that's ultimately why CO ends up coming fourth in today's debate. All right, I hope that all made sense. If anyone has any questions or any feedback, please feel free to speak to myself or either of the people on the panel. Otherwise, well done and best of luck for the rest of Euros.
Can I have